Okay, hi everybody. So I am really excited to do this plot plus character equals story workshop. I love this workshop because I feel like so often writing workshops focus on one or on the other. And I think that it's really both together that makes a story vibrant, that makes a story come alive. So whenever I give this workshop, I get really excited about talking about these things because I think they're so important. So let's jump in. So this is one of my favorite quotes from Neil Gaiman. Fiction is the lie that tells the truth. And I love this quote because it is so true about stories in general that within the made up construct of fiction, we can drill down to universal truths about human beings, universal things that we relate to, even if we've never experienced what people on the page are experiencing, we can connect with them on this very bone deep level. So, this quote really gets to me when I think about how plot and character work dovetailing with each other to create story. So, that being said, why do we read? Why are we drawn to stories? There's so many different reasons. Sometimes we read for escapism, to get out of whatever reality we're in and to feel like we're not on our own. Sometimes we read because we want to go somewhere new. We want to expand the way we see the world. Sometimes we read because we want to imagine different ways to be, different ways of existing, right? Sometimes it's the opposite, especially with series. We read because we want to imagine, how could we exist in a familiar setting? How can we connect with characters that we adore, the coffee shop in our favorite series, or the made up fantasy world in our favorite series, or people that we love revisiting? Sometimes we read because we want to learn from other people, to imagine the world could look different. Sometimes we just read because we want to immerse ourselves in a story. We just want to see how it unfolds. So, within that framework, why do we pick up particular books? There's so many reasons, right? It could be because there's a genre that appeals to us, whether it's mystery or fantasy or romance, and we just love stuff that's in that genre. Maybe we see the cover online or in a bookstore and we're drawn to that cover. We just love the artwork. Maybe there's blurbs from our favorite authors on there and we think, okay, well, if they're saying something good about it, I'll probably like it. Maybe it's the hook, by which I mean the premise, right? Maybe the premise just sucks you in. It's so cool, it's so original. Sometimes, like I said before, it's to go back to a familiar series, right? We want to be in that world. It's cozy, it's comfy, or we've missed it, or we want to know what happens. Sometimes the idea is so original that we just want to see, how do they execute this? Maybe, like in romance, it's a trope we love: enemies to lovers, accidental pregnancy, billionaire romance. Maybe it's because anything a particular author writes is a one click for us or an auto buy for us. Or maybe something about the book resonates with our personal experience and we want to see it on the page. These are all different reasons, of course, right? But once we've been grabbed in that way, what makes us keep going? Well, so a lot of different things, right? I think first and foremost, what makes me keep going is I want to know what's going to happen. And it's because I care so much about the characters already. I care about what happens to them. I care if they die, if they live, if they get what they want, if they're beaten up, if they get the job. Sometimes we keep going because we want to solve a mystery or we want to figure out if we were right when we guess that plot twist. Sometimes it's because we want to just dive into this world full of tension, full of surprises, full of, unexpected things that happen. Sometimes it's, will this damaged character become whole again? Will this underdog triumph? Sometimes we want to figure out, does a character get this thing that they wanted? If we're reading romance, sometimes we want to make sure our characters get their happy ending. Sometimes we want to make sure someone takes down a villain or we figure out how a conflict gets resolved. And sometimes it's because a story reaches us deeply emotionally. It makes us laugh. It makes us cry. It makes us rage. And we want that emotional connection. So this is the thing, right? Plot plus character. Together, they equal story. By itself, plot is just a meaningless series of things that happen. A happens, then B happens, then C happens, then D happens. Even if these things sound objectively interesting, without the characters, without caring about the characters that the plot is happening to, we're indifferent to that plot, right? So I think of characters as the engine that drives a plot forward. the choices they make, whether they succeed, whether they fail, what's happened to them beforehand. Why are they motivated to do a particular thing? They are the engine that drives that plot forward. And without it, your characters are just kind of wandering around, talking or fighting or kissing, whatever they're doing. So the problem is, without the other, plot plus character, without plot, characters are meaningless. Without characters, plot is meaningless. So together, plot plus character is going to equal your story. So even if you are someone who likes to plot, or if you're someone who is a discovery writer who flies by the seat of their pants, sometimes known as a pantser, regardless of who you are and how you get to the point of telling your story, there's usually a very familiar story structure, right? And in that familiar story structure, you're going to see a 3-act structure. Although when you're writing romance, a lot of romances have more of a 4-act structure, right? And that middle structure, that act 2, that 50%, that's going to be the bulk of your story. That's why so often people talk about the saggy middle, right? Because act 1 is the setup and act 3 is the resolution. But act 2 is where it all happens. And it's because it's so long that that's where things can kind of start to sag. There's a lot of books that will delve very deeply into plot structure on its own. Jessica Brody's Save the Cat Writes a Novel is one that I rely on a lot. But the one thing to really know is that in any given story, as readers, we are looking for familiar patterns. We're looking for the way that a story typically goes. So, for example, there's always an inciting incident, that moment after which nothing is the same as it was before, the moment where your characters are plunged into the upside down, right? They're plunged into act 2, which looks nothing like act 1. Then there's Dark Night of the Soul, right? Where your character is just in despair and nothing seems like it's ever going to be right again. And out of that comes their motivation to change. Most stories will have this. And so, familiarize yourself with story structure and then take that story structure and superimpose it on top of one of your favorite books and see how it plays out. Play with it a little bit just to see what happens. So, this is one of the things that I really think about when I'm thinking about the intersection between plot and character. It's a great quote by Lisa Cron, who wrote the iconic Wired for Story. And she says, "The events by themselves mean nothing. It's what those events mean to someone that has us compulsively turning pages." So again, the events by themselves, that's the plot. What they mean to someone, that someone is the character, and that's what keeps us reading. We want to find out what happens to that character. So here's the thing. You could be the most beautiful writer in the world. Your sentences could be gems strung together to make beautiful jewelry. Your writing is gorgeous. Your writing is lyrical. And then you're saying, why doesn't anyone want to keep reading my books? Why isn't anyone reading my stories? The thing is, and you've sometimes seen this before, books with less than writing, where we connect so completely to the characters, will completely take off. And that is because without caring about a character, the most brilliant plot in the world, the most gorgeous, lyrical, wonderful writing, it's meaningless, it's useless. The things that happen, the beautiful way that an author describes it, none of that matters if we do not care about the character. And so then the issue is, how do we make our readers care? All right, so what makes us care about a character? You do not have to like. People don't have to like your character. Your character does not have to, they could be a villain as long as we can empathize with them. So what makes us care? So your character could be, if they're on team good, let's say, they could be an underdog, or they could be a character in a vulnerable position, even if they're not a really nice person. If we see them in a vulnerable position, we might root for them. They could be kind and funny. They could be in a really tough situation, and they could make a difficult but morally correct decision, right? They could rescue a vulnerable person, rescue a vulnerable animal. Even if they're not a likable person, if they do this, we'll feel for them. They could want or need something, and we're rooting for them to get that something. Or they could stand up to a clear antagonist, right? We see that they're willing to fight for what they believe in. We see that they're standing up to a bad guy or girl, and we want them to succeed. All of these things will make us care right from the start. So that's the character side. So, how do you make plot work right from the start? If you get stuck, in terms of plot, I always encourage people to think about their plot as a what if question, because every great story that's ever been written, I would argue, could be reduced to a what if question, right? So, for example, what if a neglected orphan boy suddenly discovered he was a wizard? That's Harry Potter. What if the letters a girl wrote secretly to her old crushes were mailed to them without her knowledge or consent? That's Jenny Han's To All the Boys I've Loved Before, right? This big sprawling novel that you write, it can probably be boiled down, it can probably be distilled to a single what if question. So if you're stuck in terms of your plot, think about what that what if question might be. So before you really delve down deep into your story, find the what if question and think about how you're going to explore it. So, you know, five people could have the same what if question, and then they could think of different ways that they are going to explore that what if. The story could take different twists and turns to answer that question. Your plot, right, will answer that question, and your plot, the twists and turns that it takes, are tied so deeply into who are your characters, what do they want, what do they need, what's their deepest fear, what's their core misbelief, what are they trying to overcome. That's all tied into your plot and answering that what if question. So, something else to think about is, what point do you want your story to make? And this can sometimes be thought of as your theme, the theme of your story, but theme sounds sort of highfalutin and fancy. So, think about the point. So, this is the takeaway message that you want your readers to have when they close your story, when they close your book. And the whole story that you write is in service to this point, is in service to this theme. So, for example, in The Hate You Give, here is the point. It's important to stand up for what you know is right, even when you may face dire consequences. So, on every page, the main character is addressing that issue. She may be walking towards it, she may be pulling back from it. But that theme, that point, that message is threaded through the entire story. Okay. And at the end, it's pretty much resolved. So, before you start writing, you may want to take some time to think about that point, think about that theme, or sometimes you discover it as you're writing. And then if you discover it as you're writing, you might want to go back to the beginning and see how it's informed your pages so far. And if there's anything you want to do, just a line or two here and there to make it pop out. Okay. So, how do you get to know your characters? How do you make sure that you know them well enough that they are informing your plot? So I always look at some pretty basic stuff about my characters, and I think you can do this regardless of if you're someone who plots, regardless if you're someone who's a discovery writer. I think about, what do my main characters want, right? And I do this personally before I write a single word of the story. I do this before I outline. Even if I didn't outline, I would still do this, because I would argue that even if you don't outline, it's even more important to do this so that you understand who your characters are and how their thoughts and actions could drive the story. So, what do your main characters want when the story begins? This is their goal, and their goal should be big enough to carry them throughout the entire story. Why do they want this thing, right? That's their motivation. And it should be pretty important. It can't just be something casual. There's got to be a big reason, an important reason they want this thing. Okay, now, why can't they have what they want? What's in the way of them getting what they want, right? That's their obstacle. And if they could just get what they wanted at the beginning of the story, there'd be no conflict, there'd be no story, right? So these obstacles should stack up. They should get bigger and bigger and more important and difficult to surmount as the story progresses. All right. So, what will happen to your characters if they don't get what they want? This is the stakes of your story. And it's a pretty big deal, because if your characters can just get what they want easily, or if they don't get what they want and nothing really happens to them, why should we keep reading? We're not invested, right? We need to know that if they don't get what they want, something terrible is going to happen to them personally, to the people that they care about, or to the world around them. Okay, so then let's move on to the next piece, which is their arc. And this is composed of a lot of different pieces. So your characters want something, but invariably, this isn't what they really need. So the question is, what is your character's flaw. Sometimes this is called their ghost. Sometimes this is called their essential wound. But the idea is whatever this is, it is interfering with every aspect of your character's ability to live their best life. They're probably not even aware of it. They're not probably acknowledging it. Oftentimes you'll see a helper character, an ally, or a B character, it's sometimes called. In the beginning of the book, they'll point this flaw out to your character, the way they need to change. They may say, hey, you really need to do this. This would really help you. And your character will be like, nope, 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 nope. There is no way I'm doing that. That exact thing is the thing they need to come to their own realization about by the end of the story. So your character has a flaw that's preventing them from realizing they need to complete that arc or make that journey. That flaw is caused by a trauma or a series of traumas. Something's happened to your character to make them act this way, have this flaw, right? What is it? You should know. What is this thing or things that has happened? And then what core misbelief has your character developed as a result? What do they believe as a result of this flaw and these traumas that is absolutely not true, but yet that thing is guiding the way that they believe the world should work? So I often use the example of Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games, right? So her flaw is that she won't get close to anybody. Her trauma is that she's lost her father. She lives in this dystopian society. Every day, people are threatened to be taken away from her. She's fighting to survive, right? A series of traumas stacking up. What's her core misbelief? We only need to be out for ourselves. We only need to look out for ourselves. And life should be all about surviving because that's all there is. I can't team up with anybody else. I can't risk caring about anybody outside of my immediate circle. It's not worth it because A, they're just going to die, and then B, I'll die too. What does she need to learn? What is that contradiction that needs to happen? She needs to learn that only by caring about others, only by stepping outside of that mere survival mode and thinking about the districts as a whole, can she truly get what she needs, not just to survive, but to thrive, right? So knowing this about your characters from the beginning, I think is so, so, so important, especially if you don't outline. Okay, so again, with that goal, what is it that your characters want more than anything else in the world? This needs to be something really, really big with a really good reason. And then whatever this is that they want, it needs to drive the story. And it's great if the thing that they want is also the thing that the antagonist wants. So they're competing for the same goal. That ups the tension. So here's an example. Let's take You've Got Mail, which is, a pretty old movie. So hopefully lots of folks might know it because it's kind of timeless too. So we've got Meg Ryan, we've got Tom Hanks, right? And she runs a bookshop in New York City. He wants to open this Goliath. They both want to run a bookstore in this city, in New York City. Only one of them, as it turns out, can keep running this bookshop because from the very beginning of the story, she wants to keep running her indie. He wants to open his store, but his store puts her store out of business. And so from the very beginning, their goals are clashing. Of course, there's a whole subplot going on there with hidden identities and all sorts of good stuff. But we've got those goals from the very, very, very beginning. And the conflict is so clearly set out. And we can see who they are and why they do what they do. And it continues to drive the plot. Okay, so here we go. So in the case of You've Got Mail, right? Why is it so important to Meg Ryan's character that she continue to run that indie bookstore? Why? Well, it was her mother's bookstore, right? She's carrying on her mother's legacy. It's got real, true meaning to her. So, a lot of people can empathize with that. She lost her mother. This was her mother's dream. She's keeping it going. It's all in the family. It's got sentimental value to her. So we're going to care about that more so than just generic woman running bookstore. We have woman trying to carry on her mother's legacy and being squashed by someone far more powerful. We feel connected. We want to keep reading. We were rooting for her. She's the underdog now, right? Okay, so here we come to the obstacle. What is stopping your character from getting what they want? Why can't they have it, right? And then here comes the flaw. So your plot is acting in concert with your character's need to overcome the flaw. You develop your plot so that your character is faced with the flaw in different forms again and again and again. And the conflict is intensifying and ramping up, forcing them to confront the flaw. until by the end of the book, their character arc is that they've succeeded in overcoming the flaw and learning an important lesson, right? So that is plot and character working together. Okay, so here's the stakes, right? Dire stakes if your character does not succeed in achieving their goal. So let's take Harry Potter. If Harry Potter doesn't defeat Voldemort, there goes the world as we know it, right? The Death Eaters are going to take over everything. If Katniss Everdeen doesn't defeat the other tributes in the arena, she'll die, right? No more Katniss Everdeen. If Claire Flazer does not stop the rebellion in the first book of Outlander, all of the clans are going to be slaughtered, right? So I think, we have, I guess it's the second book at that point. But so these stakes are high and they don't need to be life and death. They need to be something that they can be very personal to your characters as well, right? They can be something that your characters feel on a very bone deep level. Or they can be something big, like in the case of The Walking Dead, we have zombies, who are taking over the world. But within that, each character has their own sub story, right? Each character has their own subplot and their own individual stakes that are going on. So now, if you think about this, right, sometimes we do have those very, very obvious life and death stakes, but you can think about those stakes on a personal level. So think about maybe a girl who is trying to make a film. That's been her dream. She's always wanted to be a filmmaker, but somehow there's an obstacle in her way. Maybe she can't afford the equipment, or maybe she's in a situation where someone wants her to become a doctor rather than a filmmaker. But she has her heart set on making this film, and maybe she enters a competition. And if she doesn't make this successful short film, she's not going to get into her dream college, and her life will be just crushed into something she doesn't want it to be. So that's very, very personal stakes, right? That's something that is just for this individual person. But yet, for her, it's the biggest deal in the world. So whatever your character's flaw is, you need to connect it very, very closely to the goal and the stakes. So all of these are working in concert. They're all working together. And again, whatever their goal is, as they work towards it, they're having this opportunity to confront their flaw, to combat their flaw head on. And ultimately, after many attempts, they need to move beyond it. Okay, so don't forget about the antagonist. Now, sometimes, of course, books are written from the point of view of the antagonist, right? Sometimes books are written as a villain origin story, and those can be fascinating and amazing as well. And to get people to really empathize with those stories, you need to build empathy for the antagonist from the very beginning, right? You need to create a situation where we feel truly that this antagonist is someone that we feel for. We may not like them, we might hate them, but we truly understand how they wound up being who they are, why they are this way. And some part of us wishes that things would turn out differently for them, right? So if your antagonist is as fully developed as your protagonist, then we will really understand them. And if you're going to do those types of character development questionnaires that we talked about in the beginning of this presentation, I would do them for your antagonist simultaneously with your protagonist, right? Because then you can see how their goals and wants and needs and flaws play off of each other. And bonus points, like I said, if they both want the same thing. Okay, and so yes, here's the helper character that we talked about before. Sometimes it's the ally, sometimes it's the B character, right? What's the point of this character? The point of this character is to help your main character see what they should know all along. What is this choice that they should be making, right? And so again, in the Hunger Games, we see Peeta, who says to Katniss at the very beginning, I just wish that there was some way for me to show them that I'm not just a pawn in their games. And she's thinking, what are you talking about? You are just a pawn in their games. We're all just pawns. I don't have the luxury of thinking like you. But in reality, that's what she has to realize. And ultimately, she does come to that realization. She supersedes the games. She creates her own game, in essence. Okay, So, how can we see all of these things tied together? That connection between the flaw, the goal, the stakes, the lesson. How can they all connect, right? So, here's a made up story. I just kind of invented it, right? But let's say there's a woman and she dreams of being the very first person ever to walk on Mars, right? But she's super independent and she will not rely on anyone else to make this dream come true because she believes they will only mess things up. They'll only screw things up. So she just feels like she needs to do everything on her own. She doesn't trust her fellow officers. Everything goes wrong again and again and again when she's up in space because of this. Well, finally, right? Her crew is about to land on Mars. Disaster ensues. So things are spiraling out of control, and she's now in this place where either she needs to confront this flaw, she has to trust her co pilot and their judgment, or she literally will die. So there's her life or death stakes right there. So her core misbelief is I've got to do everything on my own. I'm the only one who can be trusted, right? Based on this trauma. What? I don't know what it is. We didn't say it here. There's some trauma that's happened that's made her believe this. But for her to have this full character arc with these life or death stakes, she has to trust the judgment of her co pilot. The mission is saved. The two of them go off to Mars together. Those are all connected. So you see her evolution as a person, which is tied so closely into the plot. And so, yes, so as we talked about, as you do this, even as you're just talking about your characters, you're already working on so many elements of your plot. And these are the bones of what Victoria Schwab, the author, calls the story corpse, which is a metaphor that I really love. So a couple years ago, I attended this presentation virtually through Y'all Write, which was the virtual version of Y'all Fest, which is a young adult fiction conference. And V.E. Schwab had this great sort of way of looking at story where she said, the plot is the bones, the character is the muscle, the prose is the flesh. And for me, that really helped because bones, muscle, and flesh all go together, but simultaneously they need to be built in a sense, separately but in tandem. It's so visual, right? So her big point was don't worry about getting those perfect words down on the page until you build the bones and the muscle. I will say also that every writer is different. So some writers like to revise as they go. I'm one of them. Some writers just like to get the first draft out there as messy as they please and then come back and do revisions later. Either one of those ways of approaching writing is completely valid. I do think, though, that it's important to think about the fact that there are layers to storytelling, right? And so all of these layers are going to be working together in order to create story. Story is comprised of all of these different things. And so, right, when you have really gotten to know your characters well, when you understand them just to the bone, right, the choices that they make are going to go along perfectly with their flaws, with their motivations, with their history, with their goals. They're going to make these choices because of who they are and what they brought to the page. And then those choices are going to drive the plot. And then that plot, again, is going to inform the people that your characters become, right? So this is something that's very important to think about, right? Is that once you understand the point of your story, once you understand that what if question that you're asking, once you know the core goals, the wants, etc. of your character, your plot is really going to flow very naturally. Everything is linked. I do want to say that even though you know all of these things about your characters, you know their backstory, you know how they got to where they are, be very judicious about how you dispense that on the page. So, the character questionnaire that I suggest, these basic questions that I suggest that you look at, it's not one of those really in-depth questionnaires that some people think you need to know your character's favorite ice cream flavor and their favorite band and all. I mean, you can know that if it helps you fill out the character, but you do need to know your character's essential backstory. What brought them to where they are right now? Why are they here now? And when you know that backstory, then you need to be very, very careful about how it gets onto the page. So time and again, I have, in working with my writing clients, I've seen a story start, and then about halfway down the first page, we have a full on flashback. And that flashback gets us back into what the character was doing that led them to this point in time. Right. And that's very jarring to us. It takes away from the narrative momentum because you've started the story where you started it for a reason. And so you have your plot and the narrative momentum of your story moving forward for that reason. To have a flashback that pulls you out of the moment in that way, so close to the beginning of the story, unless very well done, can be extremely challenging for the reader. So I always say, you want to avoid, of course, the dreaded info dump that everybody talks about, where nothing's happening and we're just dumping a whole bunch of information about what came before and why things are the way they are and that type of a thing. But if you read the first chapter of your favorite books, you're probably going to see numerous mentions of things that happened in one way or another before the story began, right? You're going to see maybe a mention of why this character is so angry as they run down the road. You're going to maybe see a mention of who this character is in relationship to somebody else and why they love or hate or fear them so much. You're going to see whether it's like a little context clue, whether it's a brief reference to a memory, whether it's just, a sentence that reminds us that this character maybe dropped out of school. Whatever it is, it's going to be skillfully woven into the prose, that so much so that you don't even necessarily realize its backstory. You're going to connect that backstory to the front story in a way that it makes sense to us. Yes, we need to know this little bit of information about backstory in order to understand the front story. But it's not so much backstory that it jolts us out of the forward momentum of the story. And so this is another quote by Lisa Cron that I think is really worth thinking about. And it's this: the story creates beautiful writing, not the other way around. Back when I was really new to the writing game and trying to figure stuff out, I had the sort of nuts and bolts of the actual writing down pretty well, unless my sentences were pretty well written. You know, they were technically correct. Some of them were even pretty, but my stories weren't necessarily landing with readers when I first started out. And so why would that be? Well, because it's not enough to have beautiful prose. You have got to have a compelling story that is going to suck readers in. And so for me, that was a lesson that I had to kind of learn the hard way, is that it wasn't just about the quality of the prose, but it was also about my ability to get a heck of a lot better at plotting and a heck of a lot better at raising those stakes and building in those twists and turns. That wasn't something that came naturally for me, but it was so important to learn. And so, I'm not very good at math, but I like to think about like this little equation here. So ideally, you're going to have good writing, great writing, plus story, right? That is ideally what you want every time. Good writing plus story is going to be your ideal combination. But if you have story, but not good writing, that's always going to win out over good writing minus story. So I give as an example, the Twilight series. Now, I love the Twilight series. I own all the books, but I would be the first one to tell you the writing itself is not that stellar. It's okay, but it's not like, the writing is so amazing. Yet, millions of people are reading about like Sparkly Edward and then Jacob and Bella. And why? Because something in that story, whether it's like a retelling of the Beauty and the Beast myth, whether it's Bella being such a blank slate that so many people projected themselves onto her, whether it's the idea that we all want to believe that, we're special in some way and that's going to be discovered by someone who's going to single us out. There's a lot of things that, don't necessarily hit the right way with that story. But it sold and it sold and it sold, and it became a popular movie franchise and all of this stuff. And why? Because people became invested in it and they wanted to know what happened. The plot was there, our investment in the characters was there. And so even though the writing itself wasn't the most incredible writing ever, the story was obviously incredibly compelling because look at the amazing franchise that it spawned. So, this is not to say that you should not work to make your writing absolutely as good as it can be. You should, of course you should. But don't, diminish the power of strong plot, characters the readers will identify with. Those are key. Then and only then will people stick with your story long enough to appreciate your beautiful prose. Okay. So the other thing that I like to talk about is that there's no one way to write. You know, some people prefer to outline. They outline very intensely. They outline every bit of their story. Their outlines are color coded. Some people like to use software to write, like Scrivener. Some people like to write longhand. Some people do their outlines longhand and then type their stories. Some people dictate. Some people write incredibly messy first drafts and then go back and revise. Some people cannot go on to the next day until they read and fix what they've written the day before. Everybody's different in that way. Some people can churn out a book a month. Some people can churn out a book a year or every 2 years. There really is no one way to do this. And so I think that one thing I would say when you're trying to create stories that are going to resonate with readers is to honor your process and not compare your process to anybody else's process. For one thing, some people just write differently naturally than others. For another thing, the more you do this and the more that you write books, the more you're going to figure out your process, whatever it is, and you're going to get faster at it. So cut yourself some slack and try, although it's hard, to step away from the comparisonitis that we all fall victim to as writers. The other thing to think about is that, writing and publishing is a long game and it changes all the time. And so be patient with yourself. Realize that a rising tide really will lift all boats, and there's more than enough to go around in terms of success. So that's something else that I would think about too. Give yourself the time and also expect to revise. Everybody revises, whether you've been published many times, whether you're just starting out, everybody revises. And revising can be a pretty lengthy process. Sometimes you write a story and, the basic bones of it are really, really strong and it hits just right. And you're just revising on a surface level. Sometimes you write a story and there is so much work to be done because the story that you wrote isn't the way the book really needs to be to hit with yourself or to hit with the readers. And you find yourself thinking, okay, can I go back to the heart of the story and reconstruct it? Do I care enough about what this story is, the story I'm trying to tell, the characters themselves, the point I'm trying to make? Do I care enough about all of this to make it worthwhile to do that deep of a rewrite? The answer may be yes, the answer may be no, but either way, you can expect to revise. And so, when you're doing those revisions, there's a couple of things to think about. And one is to try and get some distance from your work in whatever way makes sense for you to do that, whether it's if you normally read on a screen, print out your manuscript. If you normally print out your manuscript, listen to it via something like Voice Dream Reader or even Microsoft Word's built-in replay. If you normally share stuff with a critique group, maybe find someone who hasn't read the story before to take a look at it as compared to someone who's workshopped it. Think about words that you might rely on, like crutch words, like just or seemed or realize, and see if you can get them out of there. Look at your book on a scene-by-scene level, right? Look at a scene-by-scene level to figure out whether every scene is accomplishing something. Is it advancing the plot? Is it advancing your understanding of a character? So when you're looking at story, right, and you're revising for story, are the obstacles there? Are the goals, wants, and needs there? Do the stakes keep raising and raising and raising? Do we know what's going to happen, or are we surprised at every turn? And, what matters to you about this particular story? Why is this the story that you want to tell at this time? So if you do work with a professional editor and what they say needs to happen to the story isn't true to your vision, think long and hard about whether changing it is true to the story you want to tell. So these are some of the resources that I use. Save the Cats Writes a Novel, books by Lisa Cron, One Stop for Writers, and then, of course, there's my website as well. So I encourage you to check those books out if you haven't already. And then, yeah, so these are some of my books. My young adult dystopian fantasy series is there in the middle. And then I also write romantic women's fiction. So that is off to the side. And then that's it. So now, if anyone has any questions, I would be more than happy to stick around and answer them. And I'll just give you a minute to just chime in if you have any questions that you want to share. I know some people are watching this live, but a lot of people will be seeing this later as it streams on YouTube, etc. A lot of people will be able to watch it later as well. So there may not be an opportunity for you all to ask questions, but if anyone who's watching it now wants to ask questions, this is the time. Let's see. Oh, is there any content that is too dark for YA? That's a really tricky question, and it's a hard question to answer in a generic way. I would say this. I think a lot of it has to do with how that content is handled. So if you are dealing with very, very dark content, you want to make sure that there is a reason that that content is in there, that you are communicating that content in a way that doesn't send a message that's unsafe for YA. For example, if you're dealing with a scene where consent is not present between two characters, that could get pretty dark. So then the issue is why is that there? Is that there to be part of the story because you have a specific message that you're trying to send? Is it going to impact the character throughout the story? Are you going to provide resources for readers to be able to deal with this? There is stuff that becomes inappropriate for YA fiction, particularly when you're delving into like explicit nature of romance, etc., etc. There are some lines that generally are not crossed. Other than that, I would say that, young adult readers are prepared to tackle a lot of difficult issues, but it's your responsibility as the author, if you're going to do that, to have a very good reason for it and to set it up in a framework that allows the darkness of those issues to be addressed in a healthy way. I hope that answered your question. Okay. Well, if no one else has any questions, then I guess I am going to log out. But thanks so much to Madeline and to YA Thriller Con for having me and for giving me the opportunity to share this workshop with all of you. It's been so much fun. So thanks, everybody. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.